Welcome, everyone, and a genuine thank you to our panelists for the generosity of their time and expertise today. Thank you also to Morgan Billington and our Northeastern Oakland Sustainability team, to Chung Xiang, who is our project and events manager on campus, to Dean Beth Coakley at Mills College, and Davis Bookhart, who is our senior sustainability advisor and professor of the practice in Boston. I'm Alli Chagi-Starr. I work at the intersection of AI, workforce equity, and economic justice in Oakland, designing programs that ensure underrepresented young people aren't just subjects of technological change, but shapers of it. The stakes of getting this right are immediate and real for the people and communities many of us serve. The question of who benefits and who gets left behind is what brings urgency to the topics we'll discuss today. AI is being adopted at extraordinary speed, infrastructure is being built, capital is flowing, and policies, unfortunately, are lagging. And sustainability conversations are struggling to keep pace. Because AI is not a single issue sector, it intersects environment, technology, business, economics, social justice, governance, and more. It means our conversations need to be intersectional too. And that's why this panel brings together voices from climate science, corporate accountability, public policy, workforce equity, tech worker organizing, and water resilience. AI, as we know, is here. It is not going anywhere soon. The question is not whether it advances, but how. How do we address both the risks and the opportunities? How do we build guardrails while supporting innovation? How do we ensure the transformation strengthens rather than destabilizes communities and ecosystems? This conversation may actually raise more questions than it answers, but hopefully there'll be better, more insightful questions. Because sustainability is about planet and people, it's about stewarding natural systems and nurturing the social, economic, and ethical conditions that make us responsible caretakers of our shared home. And with that, let me introduce our panelists. So today we have Heather Cooley, who is Chief Research and Program Officer at the Pacific Institute, where she has led research and programs focused on water sustainability and resilience. Her work bridges science and policy to inform decision-making at local, state, and national levels. She received a BS in molecular environmental biology and a master's degree in energy and resources from UC Berkeley. She has served in advisory and leadership roles on water policy and stakeholder committees at state and national levels. Dr. Auroop Ganguly is a distinguished professor in the College of Engineering at Northeastern on the Boston side and director of the Sustainability and Data Sciences Laboratory. He has appointments with the Curry College of Computer Science and the School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs, and serves as the Institute for Experiential AI with a focus on climate and sustainability. Was previous co-director at the Global Resilience Institute. Auroop, I think you have lots of time on your hands. His 28 years of professional research and leadership experience in the U.S. spans the private technology sector, government-owned national laboratory and academia. The overarching theme of Dr. Ganguly's research integrates weather extremes, climate adaptation, and security threats with infrastructure resilience and urban sustainability. Thank you so much for being here. Charles Orgbon III is a sustainability consultant specializing in guiding companies to accurately calculate their greenhouse gas emissions and implement data-driven decarbonization strategies. With extensive experience advising Fortune 500 clients, Charles develops robust ESG, that's environment, social, and governance systems and policies that make sustainability data reliable, actionable, and audit ready. Charles is deeply engaged with the dual role of AI and corporate sustainability. While AI and advanced analytics are powerful tools for tracking emissions, forecasting climate impacts, and identifying efficiency gains, he recognizes that AI itself drives significant energy demands, contributing to the very climate challenges companies must address. And that we'll get into in a little bit. Minisha Priyadarshini is a descendant of Taino peoples and Murmu clan within the Santali tribe. Her journey includes roles in sustainability, education, and technology across AI and cybersecurity for the public sector at GitHub, Intel, among others. She made the pivot into tech after serving in climate policy for Congressmember Julia Brownlee. She currently serves as executive director of Program Earth, which is a 501(c)(3) nonprofit that focuses on open sourcing AI and data solutions for Indigenous-led environmental conservation projects. Her work is focused on corporate climate accountability and professional engagement in climate advocacy. Her work bridges environmental, policy, strategy, stakeholder mobilization, encouraging institutions and employees to leverage their influence to advance climate responsibility. Loren Taylor is a social impact strategist, engineer, and public servant focused on leveraging technology to advance systemic change and economic equity. With a background in biomedical engineering and management consulting, he has spent more than 2 decades bridging technical innovation and community resilience, leading renewable energy and utilities initiatives, and as an Oakland City Council member, helping shape the city's environmental and climate action plan to align greenhouse gas reduction with entrepreneurship and local economic empowerment. I'm going to welcome everybody and thank you all so much for being here. And we'll start with the opening question to Minisha. At Program Earth, you work with people inside tech companies who care about climate and community. As AI infrastructure expands and energy demand grows, what role can tech workers play in demanding transparency around emissions, water use, and community impacts? And feel free to share what works for you in that question.
Yeah, and there's so many different organizations in this space that are helping people kind of find the way that they want to advocate. Some people can choose to do it through policy and like stakeholder engagement, such as like Climate Voice. And Program Earth, we tend to actually focus on how can the skills of the people in tech actually be open sourced for communities. And I think when we speak about AI, we often think about energy and water use. And what we've noticed across our projects that cover 2.6 million acres is that a lot of a lot of our tech skills are needed in the public sector, especially with water boards. And so, a lot of what we've spent the last couple of years is connecting Indigenous knowledge and recommendations on water management plans across whether it's the Utah Water Board or the Colorado. And we do this through hackathons, which are really easily available for employees to advocate for not just that like resource allotment, but like general awareness. And we do hit those kind of hard questions of like, what does AI mean in terms of how it's building these data centers across reservations? What does it mean as it competes with water rights? And we believe that having that awareness, but also having an action to take, makes it so that we don't have to just be almost paralyzed by what's happening, but we can take an active stance in it. And, across all of these companies, there are sustainability departments. And not only are there 2030 carbon goals, but there's also 2030 water goals. And I think it's up to, people in this room, people up, just to figure out how we can connect those dots.
Thank you so much for that. Move the question to Heather. As we're talking about water, AI infrastructure depends heavily on water, as we know, for cooling, and we know that many data centers are being built in rural areas with limited infrastructure. As a longtime water analyst globally, what are the long-term impacts on rural water systems, ratepayers, and ecosystems related to AI's water footprint?
Great, thank you, Alli. Just to back up a little bit, I do think it's important to talk about how much water these systems are using. They're using water. Data centers are using water directly for cooling and for humidifying of the server. They are also though using water indirectly. And the primary indirect use is for generating electricity. So, there's a significant amount of water that these systems can use. Just for context, a small data center typically would consume about 18,000 gallons of water per day, while a mid-sized data center would consume about 300,000 gallons per day. And hyperscalers, which are the largest data centers that are operated by many of the major tech companies, those are typically consuming several million gallons of water per day. And those are at very specific locations, right? They're not spread out broadly. So an issue in ensuring there's water, particularly in rural areas, is that is a significant new demand. Data centers are looking to rural areas that are attractive because of the lower land and often energy prices. And of course, rural areas are sort of interested in data centers because of the opportunity for tax revenue and the prospect of new jobs. One of the challenges, I think, is that there's often sort of a disconnect between land use and water planning. And that's true not only in rural areas, that's true in urban areas as well. And the idea that many decisions are made about where to site something, what to build, and water is sort of an afterthought. It's not part of the decision making. Do we have enough water to actually provide this facility? And so that is an issue. That's an issue, again, both in urban and rural areas. But there are unique issues in rural areas. I've kind of highlighted and talked about the water intensity. The reality is that the existing infrastructure in those rural areas may not have that capacity to serve that new large demand. And so constructing the data center would require major upgrades in the capacity of water and wastewater systems. Building that new water and wastewater infrastructure is expensive. And those costs may be passed on to local residents. That's really a function of how water pricing and water rates work in that particular area. But then another issue is what happens if the data center leaves or significantly alters their operations to use less water and energy? Who then pays for those stranded assets? And then there may be impacts on the environment. Again, that depends on where the water is sort of sourced from, where the wastewater is disposed of. And I think a key challenge for rural areas, again, those aren't unique to rural areas. Those are issues we see in urban areas. But what I think is often unique in rural areas is that these communities may be under-resourced. They may not have the staff or the expertise or the plans already in place to sort of meaningfully address them. And that's at a time, too, when some data center developers are insisting on non-disclosure agreements, which can create mistrust and limit the ability of locals to effectively engage and advocate for their own interest. I'll say, though, just quickly on the flip side, if done well, we could think of data centers as providing sort of meaningful benefits for communities. They could help introduce renewable energy into the grid. They could offer much needed water investments in rural areas, but doing so would really require sort of a need for transparency and community benefit agreements, those sorts of things in place so that those communities could really see those benefits materialize.
Yeah, makes sense. Thank you for that. Auroop, we're hearing about problems created by AI. We just discussed water, also energy usage of these data centers, and also emissions generated during AI. We're looking at issues around bias and misinformation, as well as job loss. Based on your work on weather, water, climate, and transportation, other hazards, what do you think do you think that the benefits of AI outweigh the disadvantages? What's your thoughts on that?
So that's an interesting point. And as I was just listening to Heather, there are several things, thoughts that come to mind. First of all, it's not either or a binary in the sense that it's not a direct comparison or doesn't have to be a head-to-head comparison between here are the benefits and here are the disadvantages of AI. So just to give a specific example, Heather talked about power production. And we have done some work for the US Department of Energy on water stress and how that relates to power production. And water stress in that case includes warmer water because a lot of the water in power production is used for cooling. So warmer water has a negative effect on the efficiency of power production. And then, of course, water scarcity. By the way, warmer water also has impacts on ecosystems because the effluent that goes out, there are some, they have to be below some temperature thresholds. To your point, to your question about, benefits versus disadvantages, it is one way to think about the disadvantages of, let's say, uh, power generation, just as an example, is it uses so much water. It might lead to warmer waters that's sent out as effluent. But isn't it useful for the power plant itself, just for their own mission readiness, to make sure that they are resilient to these kind of water stress, or they consider these kind of water stress, even ignoring the impacts on the community, which I am not suggesting we should, but just for their own example. So I think something similar works for data centers. It's one thing to say, okay, we don't have to care about these communities, we can do what we wish. We drive so much percent of the US growth in GDP. But data centers themselves have to be mission ready. And for that, they need to make sure that there are no issues with, there is no infighting among the communities versus data center, and they have the amount of water they need, and they are operating efficiently. So in that sense, we don't have to always get into that argument about benefits versus disadvantages, because it benefits both. The same kind of thing about, you mentioned biases and misinformation. I know this panel is on sustainability, but let me just digress a bit and get into security kind of challenges. So if you think about biases and misinformation, and if you think of security lines, so if somebody is just caught because that person is different, has a different accent, speaks differently, looks different, and that person is detained as a potential security threat. That's an enormous stress on the people who actually have to, see or examine them to see if they are real threats. So these kind of biases and misinformation is not only uh, disadvantage in itself, this kind of bias in this case, but it is also something that prevents the mission from getting accomplished. So what I would say is that these are independent, almost independent, but dimensions, in the sense that we have to increase the benefits, but also reduce the disadvantages, because they impact one another ultimately. And also, the one thing we have to be sort of pragmatic is that, given the growth that we are seeing in AI and data centers, even if some of us wanted to reduce that growth a little bit, which in some cases may not be such a bad thing, but it's hard to motivate that. It's hard to, make that happen. And it has always been in the, history of technology. What have we been able to stop technology-wise? Right. There are a few examples, but very few. So in from that perspective, also we have to think of, okay, can we reduce the bad effects while trying to maximize the benefits? And in fact, reducing the bad effects might actually lead to further benefits. Ali?
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. I'm going to move to Charles. Relatedly, we've been talking about data centers and their expansion. The question is, given data centers are expanding often in lower income and politically vulnerable communities, what are the downstream impacts on energy costs, grid stability, and environmental health? How should companies account for those externalities? And thanks again for being here, Charles.
Certainly. So the speakers so far have made some really great points about the limited resources that we have on this planet. And I liked when we talk about water, for instance. I love telling people that the water that we drink today is the same water that dinosaurs splashed in as well. And so when we think about how we share these resources for agriculture and feeding people to um, daily human use to industrial processes, there's also an energy component as well, because what kind of energy did we use to sort of take and process that water to get it to where we need to use it and in the form that we need to use it in, such as like sanitizing it, so forth. Um, and your question though was about externalities. And when I work in with corporations, my corporate clients, um, we really look to legislation and policy to sort of drive the internalization of external costs. But just stepping back a bit, like um, the question is framed as a negative externality, and I do believe that right now we're experiencing a lot of negative externalities with AI. But let's not also forget there are also positive externalities that can happen as well. And what do I mean by externalities? Unintended, often unpriced environmental cost or benefits that AI development and its uses can impose onto society. Some of those benefits being like how AI can also help us identify environmental degradation and help us protect our planet, such as IDing when is deforestation happening in the Amazon, for instance? When are oil tankers releasing oil into the ocean, for instance, by looking at satellite data and identifying trends and then being able to pinpoint and tag with against data sources potential polluters. So are companies integrating these negative externalities into how they think about it right now? No, they're not actually. But there are bills such as in California, the first ever AB 2619 addressing water resources for data centers. And so that's one way that companies can start to think, oh, okay, well, if we're eventually going to be regulated in this space, then we can start developing buildings and systems now to anticipate that. Otherwise, they won't. They won't find the need to that. Now, one of the things that could be a hope still is just the cost. And so these are not externalities, these are very much internal costs to these companies because to explain those costs, I think I shared with people like your phone, for instance. If there's a place on your phone that feels a little warmer than the other places, there's a place on your laptop that feels a little warmer than the other places. That's the processing power. That's the heat that's being taken out, that's being expressed because of the processing power of these computers. We have a telecommunication empire in our hands. But also imagine if the room that you're sitting in right now, if it was that processor, do you think that it would be that how hot do you think that room would get? Do you think that you would be able to stay in that room? Do you think that it would be a comfortable temperature? Anyone who has data centers on site in like corporate buildings, for instance, they may have the data servers, for instance. No one wants to go down to the data server room. It's so hot. It's like stepping into an oven. That's why these systems are built to put the water through to keep it cold, just like your phone would turn off if it gets too hot. So that's a small device. But when we think about large scale, now we're talking about lots of heat being generated, lots of energy, and lots of demand for it. And we know what happens when there's less of something, when something becomes more scarce, the price goes up. And so, whether it's water or whether it's energy, those internal costs can also drive innovation for companies.
Thank you, Charles, and thank you for lifting up just why policy and regulation tie into what we need to be thinking, especially for companies. And in that line of thought, moving to Loren Taylor, from your experience at the local level, shaping Oakland's environmental and climate action plan, what local or state policy tools could better align with AI growth and climate and equity goals? And how should policymakers prepare for that disruption or the disruption that's already here?
Absolutely. And first of all, I have to acknowledge that as I drink my water here, I am going to continually think back that I'm drinking dinosaur bathwater. So thank you for that, Charles. Um, now, when we talk about Oakland, the work on the ground, when we developed the Environmental Climate Action Plan, the ECAP, I think it was groundbreaking because it was we refused to separate environmental goals from economic justice, and so that same integration is now what we need and what we need urgently when we talk about AI governance. So the ECAP, it taught me that the best climate plans are going to fail without the community's economic anchoring. People simply just don't protect what doesn't protect them. And so if we talk about esoteric, environmental, et cetera, but it's not grounded in their reality and their day to day, and they're not seeing benefit or a path towards benefit, then it's going to be tough, a tough sell. So right now with AI, data centers are being cited with the logic of 1950s highway systems, right? You're coming in, you're seeking cheap land, cheap power, those who are politically vulnerable, displacing communities or really sort of take advantage of it. And that it's a policy failure in the making if you don't, as Charles said, have government that sets the policy guardrails, that's looking out for folks who don't otherwise have the agency to look out for themselves. So specific tools that we're talking about, community benefits agreements that was already mentioned, those specifically tied to AI infrastructure, permits. That's what government has as a leverage point, the permitting. You can require local hiring, workforce training, the emissions offsets, other conditions of development that go along with the approvals. The zoning, conditional use permits, making sure that they have explicit climate benchmarks tied to them, requiring the transparency of data centers disclosing the water, energy usage, what their sort of activities are to mitigate them. When you talk about state level AI Accountability Act, so I think Charles also mentioned the California, how we have certain sort of bills and resolutions that are coming in order to provide more environmental review, requiring sort of tech impact statements. Those are going to be important relative to the aspect of if we don't measure it, we don't create the transparency, we're never going to achieve those goals that we set out for in terms of resilience. And then most of all, we have procurement power. That we are major purchasers, government AI contracts, other controls. We see that playing out at the national level with the federal government and Anthropic versus Open AI, and so the purchasing power can drive certain concessions, accommodations, requirements of vendors, and that's got to be used well and strategically on behalf of communities as well. So those are all, I think, a few tools that we should absolutely be leaning into and helping to design. Reality is most elected officials are 18, 24 months, even more behind when it comes to the technology curve. And it's not necessarily because it's not a knock on them. It's more they just don't have the capacity to keep up and be ahead. And so that's why it's important to build, I think, also the infrastructure within government at all levels to understand the technology to help guide the policymakers, really learning and coming up with that knowledge on behalf of communities. So those are, I guess, a couple thoughts on what's needed from the legislative side when it comes to balancing the environmental sustainability along with supporting our communities as they seek their own economic stability.
Thank you for that, Loren. And I'm, aware that a lot of us on the call are California and Massachusetts, more progressive policy states. And may we encourage our governments to continue to set policy that makes a difference for the nation, and then may we do the work that a lot of people are doing on this call to make sure that our governments and private industry are accountable and uphold those goals. So thank you so much for that. Charles, I'm going to move back to you. We're constantly talking about this sort of balancing act, right? Around, the challenges and the opportunity. And this question is sort of more related to looking at grids, which still rely heavily on fossil fuels. And I'm wondering if you can speak briefly to how do we reconcile AI-driven innovation with the risk that deepens societal reliance on carbon-intensive energy. You've talked a little bit about that, and I will say we have less than 30 minutes, and I'm hoping to get to all of our questions. In the last 15 minutes, we'll open up the chat for questions. So, unfortunately, we could probably talk about this all day, but we'll keep it succinct going forward.
So I do work with real estate asset managers, and anyone who works in this space knows that there used to be that saying, location, location, location. Now it's location, location, energy. Because before you can build, you then have to, in California, work with PG&E to get the permits. Can the load of this building actually be supported by the existing energy infrastructure? And sometimes the answer is no. Sometimes things need to be upgraded in order for things to be built, and energy then becomes the limiting factor. And so there's a lot to be said about how our grid does need to be updated, but then also what's the energy that's going into that grid. If we're going to continue to demand uh, increased energy, right, with AI, then it does beg us to also address like what energy. And thankfully, through market forces, coal and the dirtiest forms of energy are not as viable anymore economically. And this is why we have to transition to renewable solar energy, solar wind, but also nuclear has to be part of our equation as well. I think there's a long story in history we have in the United States about our thoughts about nuclear and our attitudes toward nuclear, but the technology we have today is not shrouded with the same mistakes that we've had in the past. There are countries like France that we can look to as examples that are generating a massive amount of their electricity from renewable energy. And I think if you asked people too about the waste of nuclear energy, how much do you think, from if you took all the waste from nuclear energy that's ever been generated, how big are we talking about? Do you think it's like the size of a lake, or the size of a state, or how about a swimming pool? How about a swimming pool? There's the amount of nuclear waste is really not, it's a really significant problem, but it's not as big as people think it is. And so I think there's a lot for us to take advantage of there.
Thank you, Charles. We'll have to duke that one out later since we know each other.
Yeah, because the kind of
Yeah,
nuclear that
no,
you'd use to make bombs is not the same that you use to make
indeed,
energy.
Thank you for that. I'm going to move back to Minisha. So, we were talking about climate and AI systems, increasingly rely on data extraction and modeling. How do we ensure we are not overriding indigenous sovereignty and knowledge systems, but instead respecting and integrating community-led approaches to land and resilience?
I think one takeaway I'd want people to have from this question is how they can question the reciprocity in all of the systems that they're building. And I think a lot of what made us hopeful when we started this work was, more than 80% of the world's biodiversity is stewarded by indigenous communities. And when we think about water, there's been different modelings by like One Earth, which shows that, you can have the size of of an Olympic swimming pool filled up if we like reforest 100 acres. Within a year, you could potentially see that much water being replenished. And when, when we bring up kind of these use cases of the data modeling with I see it as like we need to bridge kind of current technologies with what I like to think of the original AI as an ancestral intelligence. And part of that is because, even now that we have these like drones and satellites, for example, monitoring the Amazonian rainforest, there's also, barriers to that for just by the ecosystem and its design. So, like, for example, there's so much cloud coverage, sometimes you're not actually able to have all of the imaging come through, or the incongruence of a lot of the biodiversity within the Amazon makes it hard to just use AI cameras. And that's where, we work and really rely on the traditional ecological knowledge. There's also a lot of blind spots. For example, we had done, I see this as like a beautiful bridge of where we worked with Humboldt University up on the Klamath to install monitors for the salmon. And this was around the time that people were still discussing whether, the dam should come down on the Klamath River. And, you had Hoopa and Karuk communities speaking to, their relationship with the salmon, the sacred pathway that the salmon, travels, but perhaps there was like a need to translate that for members of the Californian Water Board, specifically when they were judging whether they should, dredge certain wetlands close to the river, should the dams come down. And we basically got to model the salmon's journey, how it's important that, the wetlands stay because that's where salmon and herring spawn. They go to the ocean where, they will cultivate marine derived nutrients. And when they come back to the river and then come to end of life, those, nutrients of nitrogen and phosphorus are actually a trigger point for the germination of a lot of the native fire resilient plants on the bank and areas nearby. That specifically affects, our risk of floods, risk of wildfires, and that became a huge contention point of the $110 billion forecasted across the next 20 years to combat those sort of climate risk events. So I think there's a bridge to be had. And in some ways, I actually think some of the streamlining of this data is really interesting because it's not that, fish and wildlife departments, for example, haven't gone to indigenous communities in the last decades or universities. I do think that this sort of data streamlining might create, if, we're really diligent about it, a really good way to like validate that sort of knowledge transfer and the types of reciprocity. And I think that reciprocity can play in more equitable policies that respect land and water rights, potentially like workforce development, as was mentioned before. We're seeing actually quite a bit of that right now in the Four Corners. Like we mentioned, there's this watershed plan that is being informed by the Ute Mountain Ute and several chapters of the Navajo Nation. Now, that sort of credibility and bridge building has also now created these micro credentials, which will allow more Native and rural members of that community to actually directly play a part in their own like local water departments, right, and environmental departments. So I think, yeah, it's many-fold. It is from that policy lens. It is from that administrative lens, and of course, it's ultimately also reframing the nature of relationship that we have with nature.
Indeed. Thank you for that. And speaking about localities and mutuality, this question's for Heather. If local residents or policymakers want to ensure AI infrastructure aligns with water resilience goals, what tools or AI innovations are most effective? I know you touched a little bit on some of the innovations, maybe pertaining to disclosure laws, zoning authority, water pricing reform, or procurement standards?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. I do think, and others have hit on it, that disclosure is absolutely essential. Non-disclosure agreements are being used in areas that obviously needs to change. Data are very limited on data center water use, and it is a rapidly evolving space. We are seeing much larger data centers. We are also, though, seeing that there are advanced technologies that could dramatically improve the efficiency of those data centers so that they are less water and energy intensive. And without that data or information, we have a hard time understanding and then addressing key issues. I do think prohibitions on non-disclosure agreements so that local government and residents can weigh in on the benefits and risks are critically important. I do think ultimately these are local decisions, and people need to understand what the real benefits and risks are. I think in some instances, some of the benefits, some of the job benefits have been overstated. Some of the risks have been understated. And again, this is why we need good data and information. You mentioned pricing reform. I do think that is a critical one as well. As I have described already, because of the intensity of the water use and to the fact that it's really their peak. They're not using water consistently throughout the year. They're very peaky, as it's called. So there are certain seasons, there are certain times of the day when the cooling requirements will be high. And so that then the water system and the wastewater system has to build to those peak demands. That is where the very high cost can come in. And so ensuring that new developments pay for those costs. And that they aren't shifted to the customer base, I think is going to be critically important. And as I mentioned, there is a risk of stranded assets, ensuring that those assets are in fact stranded, that there are opportunities and ways for the developer to contribute to perhaps turning those facilities off, decommissioning them, whatever sort of needed to make sure that, again, the residents who are there aren't left, holding the bag, so to speak. Loren Taylor talked about a number of local ordinances and community benefit agreements. I think those are essential. I also think in terms of the local ordinances, which he didn't touch on, but are possible, are establishing efficiency requirements and benchmarks. They can require certain cooling requirements, for example. And again, I think because of some of the trade-offs between water and energy, those really need to be done at that local level so that people understand. In some instances, shifting towards more water efficient can cause higher energy use and vice versa. And so, understanding what the local constraints are can help inform some of those choices.
Thank you, Heather. Moving to thinking a little bit more about educational environments. I run a program called Bridge to AI, and because we have Dr. Ganguly on the call today, I wanted to, and Northeastern is a university committed to experiential education and innovation. I wanted to ask you about the use of AI in the classroom for climate sustainability or data science courses that you teach. Is this good for students and for instructors? We're really looking at the use of AI in the classroom in high schools in Oakland right now, and just want to see if you could take a moment to kind of dig into the perception that AI is sort of taking over everything, and how is it useful? How is it not in the classroom?
That's a good question. So I teach, I teach a few courses, like you said, on both climate sustainability and then data sciences, which includes AI. Most of those in the classroom, and some of those even study abroad, taking advantage of Northeastern's Dialogue of Civilizations program. So there is a perception, and some of those based on serious studies that have already been done, that just to put it a bit bluntly, that the use of AI is making the AI system smarter and the humans dumber. Now,
Mhm.
that's of course a gross generalization. Uh, we also have seen some studies that say that, the use of AI is making smart people smarter, dumb people dumber, etc. I mean, again, I'm not sure we can categorize people like that, but point being that yes, we are seeing that blind use of AI is leading both to problematic end results. So there will have to be humans in the loop, but also it's reducing the capability of humans in general. This is based on various learning studies, but also in a very small way, what I have seen in my class, to the capability or the maybe not capability, but the inclination of the human learners to think on their own. So I teach a course called Climate Science, Engineering, Adaptation, and Policy. So let me start with that. So I write codes on chaos theory and encourage the students to write those codes. We can see some of these butterfly effects, and it immediately sort of hooks them to the class. Nowadays, reality is if I just ask an LLM, whether it's Claude, since we use Claude AI in Northeastern, write those codes, show those results, it will. And it will do it in some sense much better than what our students will do and what I will do when I'm explaining to my students. Because when I'm explaining, the whole focus is not on code optimization, but on explainability. However, the ability to learn these internal workings of what chaos theory means and the thrill that you get, oh, I have written this code myself and here it's what is generating. Let me change this one thing in my code and see what happens. Those kind of things could be lost. The other thing that happens is today, at least today's AI, if I now ask it to do something more uh, little bit more heavier in the sense, take this paper that I have and write a code for this, it doesn't do so well unless there is very strong human guidance. As of now, that could change, but what we are seeing more and more is that humans in the loop are very much needed. However, this AI is progressing, humans in the loop are very much needed. This applies to the classroom. This also applies in general. If AI systems were to progress to the point where they look at the various ways in which we do mathematics and then they come up with the concept of zero and the decimal system, or they look at the mass of data from planetary systems from the Earth and come up with Newton's laws of motion or Einstein's theory of relativity, I'd say, okay, but we are not really there yet. The other thing I wanted to emphasize in some of the work that we do, so weather prediction has become a sort of poster child for AI, or at least one of the poster childs. It's not AI as in language models, but it's AI, it's still information processing, predictive modeling. So it's doing very well. But to be able to train those models, in addition to observations, we still need reanalysis data. And reanalysis data is observations embedded into physics-based weather models. So you still need those physics-based models even to be able to train those AI-based systems. So we have to be a bit careful here in terms of the instruction and the students. We do not want to take away certain tools that are important for them, and AI is certainly one of those tools, but we do not want to take away their ability to think, their ability to interact in a much better way uh, with these AI systems now and in the future. Ali, over.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. And I realize we should have an entire conversation just on education AI next time, on any of these topics. So the next set of questions, Lauren, I'm going to have you end this series of questions in just a moment. But for the last questions. We're going to have to whip through them. And unfortunately, we'll have to pick up the more detailed conversations our next time around. And we do hope to do this again. So Loren, as a former, public servant, maybe we're all public servants at the end of the day, and as a business consultant, you've spoken about ensuring marginalized communities are not not just participants, but owners in the green transition. In the age of AI, what does ownership look like in practical terms?
Of course, yeah. I think it's important for all of us to recognize that participation without ownership, it's really just a fancier form of extraction. And our communities, lower income communities, BIPOC communities, indigenous communities, they have been extracted from long enough and given so much. So we talk about you talked about the three different sort of ownership layers: data, data, infrastructure, business ownership. And so with data, we've got health data, environmental sensors, consumer data, behavioral data, all of these things that our AI systems are used and being used to train, and then they sell it back to us as a service. And that's not innovation. That's colonialism with better branding, right? Instead, we should have community data trusts, mandatory data benefit sharing, where if a company profits, the community also gets benefit, a portion of that value that's created. Indigenous data sovereignty frameworks like what we see with Program Earth and sort of other models that are out there, right? So on the data side, there are mechanisms to put in place. When you talk about infrastructure, infrastructure is needed to fuel the green economy. This physical infrastructure, whether it's solar arrays, battery storage, EV, like the range of infrastructure that's out there. And the question is the community co-owning this? Are there ways for us to participate and not just be supplanted or displaced? Cooperative utility models where it's community-based, municipal broadband, where if we as individuals can't own it, the government can sort of take that and then create that value, as opposed to having that value extracted and going just to shareholders. Different models that can be facilitated through that. And then on the business ownership side, when I was CEO of Zaru Systems, our thesis was that the future of sustainable food systems went through the community, urban settings where there was you were part of the supply chain and not just being supplied to or the labor for that work. And so targeted procurement activities, community development, finance opportunities, and then workforce development pipelines that actually lead to equity ownership and not just being an employee. So that aspect of like, if it's not whether or not communities will be impacted or a part of this AI green economy. It's, are we going to be on the payroll or are we going to be on the cap table? And we need to make sure that more of us have equity, stakes, ownership, and that we get that benefit shared. And so that's why I'm so passionate about ownership, because that's what creates the true freedom and liberation, so that we can benefit and then plot the course and address this divide that unfortunately continues to expand. So those are my
Yes,
thoughts. Yeah.
I love that conversation, and I hope we can pick that back up again. A lot of us, I think, on the call are passionate about the workforce development side of this, and appreciate you highlighting that. Going to our last round of questions, and we're just going to fly through these. For those who do need to drop off right at the hour, we will have a recording available. But for those who want to stay on for another 15 minutes, we will have time to answer questions in the chat. So feel free to prepare those. And thank you, Chung, for helping monitor that. So this question is for Heather. When it comes to looking at drought, what trade-offs should the next generation be prepared to confront?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one of the issues, we've talked about the sort of water intensity of modern large data centers. And, I think when we look at those, we can see that water has not been a consideration in siting designs. And as evidence of that, 2/3 of built and planned data centers in the US are in water stressed areas. And so, herein we're making a trade-off, right, between sort of land use and water planning. But I do think, as we look at this issue more broadly, I think, there's an opportunity for us to be thinking about the trade-off between water and energy. We've talked, although there are strategies to sort of address those and have synergies. So we've talked a lot about the direct use of water, but one of the largest uses of water is actually indirect, right? It's in cooling the power plants that are then used to generate electricity. That uses a significant amount of water, at least when it's powered by thermal-based power, fossil fuels, even nuclear. So we can be looking at the potential for renewables that address carbon issues, of course, address some of the air quality and local air pollution, but are also much less water intensive than some of the fossil fuels and other options, in particular solar and PV. So I think there are some opportunities where there are not, in fact, trade-offs, but in fact, win-wins. And I think we need to perhaps shift our mindset here. We've talked a lot about the risks of data centers and the impacts they might pose for local communities. But again, if we're making significant investments in regions, we could be doing that through community benefit agreement in a way that benefits both parties. So I think we should be questioning whether trade-offs, there are lots of opportunities for win-wins. And I think we need to be looking at not as a zero-sum game, but what are ways we can kind of raise all boats and meet a larger set of objectives.
Thank you so much. In a word, Minisha, what are some action steps that students or community members might take? There are students on this call.
I mean, if I were to say one sentence, like you don't have to tech for big tech. You can actually tech for nature. In fact, the EPA estimates that 30 to 50% of jobs in water and land management professionals are going to retire within that in the next 10 years. And guess what? AI is actually not going to replace that need. We actually need to be on the field. We need to be working with Indigenous communities to preserve that knowledge. Because my time at GitHub taught me that AI models are only as strong as their data sets. So right now, most models will have 0.3 to 0.7% hallucination when it comes to code. But when it comes to creating nature-based solution proposals, that number jumps between 6 to 17%. Do we want nature reforestation-based solutions to have that rate of error? Probably not. As a shameless plug, I will say we do have something called the Open Earth Academy, which helps you work with different tribal GIS alliances to, if you are interested in tech, how to go ahead and apply those skills for Indigenous communities, for water boards, and we have like actual projects that you can be hands-on with in open source. It also is a great directory for like if you're more of a policy-based person and you want to start like a green affinity group within your organization, because you can do policy at any level, whether it's your university, your company. It also has a great directory for other organizations that we send you to if you're more in the policy field.
Thanks, Minisha. Appreciate that. And Charles, what can employees, investors, and business leaders push for greater accountability in a word or two?
Normally, I would say that policy could be the driver. But I also am hearing that there's a chilling effect right now on environmental policy. And one of the levers we could have looked to was like policy around greenhouse gas emissions disclosure, which there's not a lot of excitement about that right now, unfortunately, in this administration. However, in place of that, I am hearing conversations where investors are coming to quarterly earning calls and asking their portfolios, what are you doing with respect to these environmental and climate risk? And there's a lot of power there. And that does make companies think, oh, we need to come up with a strategy. We need to develop a strategy. This can't just be mindless growth.
Yeah, exactly. A final question for Auroop. Are human experts really needed, given that AI can supposedly learn everything from data? Is there any fear about the explosive growth of AI that keeps you awake at night? I love
So I
asking
would,
professors this question.
so I would just echo what couple of things. One thing that Heather said about the win-win. So I already made a case just emphasizing that yes, human experts are needed, will be needed in the foreseeable future, and there may be some fundamental limits to what AI can do, for which human in the loop AI will continue to be important. Regarding what keeps me up at night, well, many things, but one of the important points about AI is sometimes it's not the technology, it's how we humans use it. And one thing that I'm very fearful of, and I think Loren and Charles and others emphasize this point in various ways, is we may end up giving a whole lot of power, much more than they currently have, to a very few set of people and very few organizations. And as we know, they don't consider themselves very accountable, do they?
Exactly. Yeah, thank you for that. I am putting links into the chat if you want to get in touch with speakers again after this, and if you are interested in their organizational work. And also for participants, if you feel like asking a question or collaborating with someone else, feel free to include your information as well. So let's see, I'm turning to Loren. I want to, kind of think about a little bit about how communities should be organizing right now, especially given the concern about AI-driven job displacement and framing that as a sustainability issue. I think of sustainability as people and planet. So what would you say? How should we be organizing in Oakland and beyond?
Yeah, so we all have to take full accountability. I appreciate this question because we can't simply defer this to some other group, some other knowledgeable source, et cetera. Frankly, different areas to look at: workforce policy. So pushing for whether universal basic income or even a transition income support with transitioning from one skill to another as the workforce really shifts. We can't just expect people to automatically just know what's needed for this evolving economy. Being involved with respect to our school boards, our community colleges, those workforce development programs, those who are really designing and setting that up, we've all got knowledge to bring to bear and an advocacy voice in order to help shift things in the right direction. Obviously, City Hall or whichever, at whatever level, whether it's the county, state, broadly, but engaging to make sure that folks know that, hey, we are paying attention. We need that transparency, and we want the community ownership that's going to be critical for the sustainability. The reality is that, you cannot decouple the environmental sustainability from the economic sustainability. A community that has 40% unemployment rate is not sustainable. If we have these challenges, people are not going to be able to invest in whether it's investing in the efficiency upgrades that they need in their homes or withstanding the weather, climate challenges, et cetera. So we need to create that resilient sustainability and just the infrastructure locally. Corporate accountability campaigns, worker empowerment, especially focusing on AI adjacent industries, those that are going to be resilient, even sort of outside of what's happening in the direct lane of the tech and AI jobs.
Thank you for that. I'm going to ask a couple of questions that came from our Q&A, and I think we may only have time for two. Janet Garcia asked, as students in technical programs like Applied AI, what are some practical ways we can help address AI sustainability challenges? Are there specific research labs or communities you would recommend getting involved with so we can help alleviate some of the issues? Does anyone want to take that one? And yes, I saw Susan said get big up Symphonia in the who's here, and if I'm saying your name correctly, Miss Foster. Thank you for being such a, having your camera on, just being just such a force of support on this call. I've been appreciating you. So, and Susan's a friend. So, anyone want to take Janet's question?
So, if I understood the question right, is this about how to make, let's say, AI computation, sustainable, water use sustainable? So there could be many aspects to that question.
And she's asked about research labs, like what communities
Research
or
lab.
research labs could she join?
So there are various communities that do, or research communities that do computational sustainability. So how to make computation itself sustainable. One top research lab was at Cornell University, led by Carla Gomez. I'm not sure if she's emeritus now or not, but she and her students who are now all over. So if you just follow Carla Gomez and see where her students are, you'll find a lot of people working on computational sustainability and similar areas. So that's one. There have been various AI institutes. These are National Science Foundation funded AI institutes, and some of them focus on various aspects of sustainability or sustainable computing. Unfortunately, some of the AI breakthroughs these days, of course, have been happening in the research labs of the private industry. And despite a lot of noise that we hear there about, oh, equity or oh, this, that's not where some of that core research is happening. And I wish a little bit more would happen there.
We have a question from, oh, go ahead. Do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I was just going to add, this may not be directly in the research line, but in terms of applied AI and looking at government, there is an organization, GovAI, that was developed, actually started in San Jose with Mayor Matt Mahan and his team. And they are pulling together government leaders from across the country to establish a collaborative working group thought leadership on how to apply AI and policy and oversight governance through government municipalities. And so that's one way that I would suggest potentially getting involved on the application side from at least the government agency level.
I was just on a call with all of those guys, and I have some slides from that conversation from Fuse Corps. If anyone's interested, just hit me up in the chat. Whitney was saying, I worry that conversations around economic benefits and participatory procedures outweigh intergenerational risks and how to communicate uncertainty, especially as local governments, communities face a knowledge deficit compared to large companies who want to cite centers. What kind of scientific fact-finding groups are out there working to communicate these uncertainties so communities can consider long-term environmental issues? That's a doozy. Anyone want
Thanks
to
for
talk about that? Communicating uncertainty. Yes.
I was going to say thanks for pasting in the chat. I'm still digesting the
Yeah,
question.
that is a huge one right there. And I do think there is that unequal balance. There's an economic term where one side has more information than another, and that creates that unequal playing field. And
I
I think all of us experience this uncertainty. Charles?
The best way I know to sort of back into this question is I learned by doing some work with the utility and data centers on the East Coast, how can the utility really show up as a thoughtful partner to the community? Because one of the things I realized is the utility might have said things like, we want community engagement, we want the community involved, we want community input. But what we learned through this process is you can't expect the community to be experts in every aspect of this corporate driven project. Like this corporate driven project, for instance, change the amount of concrete to permeable surface that was in the area and contributed to had an impact on stormwater management. The community doesn't know what the 10, 30-year stormwater management plan is. That's not popular knowledge. That's not common knowledge for residents of that community. But there is a responsibility for the utility to help explain and communicate what do they know about all of the aspects that their project is going to have. And then also share that in a way that the community does understand. The community does know what does the building look like because they see that. The community does know what their water bills are going to be like, what their energy bills are because they pay that every month. But they may not know every single aspect of how this project is going to impact their lives. And there's a responsibility that the utility has to communicate what they know.
Thank you,
One
Charles.
thing
One more, and then we're going to wrap up. Go ahead.
yeah,
Sorry
sorry,
about
Ali. One thing I wanted to mention is that this question is a very important one. It's not just asking about unknown unknowns, but it's also asking about unknown unknowns in the context of information asymmetry, especially when these few people or few corporations, own all of that. So I think that's where it's incredibly important to have independent oversight. I mean, we have seen companies getting rid of their, people who used to focus on DEI or this or that. This almost has to be a regulation. You need independent oversight and not from inside your company who ultimately reports to your own CEO.
Exactly. So important. I want to take a moment and thank our panelists again. I want to encourage everyone to share information if they feel comfortable sharing their contact information or an area you would like to work on. We will provide the recording, and we know that conversations like this are just the beginning. They invite more questions and deeper questions so that we can have not just 101 level conversations, but 201, 301 level conversations. This is an opportunity to organize. So for me, it's not enough to just have a group of amazing people come together and talk, but what can we all do as a community to keep this conversation going from coast to coast? So big thank yous to everyone who put this together today, for the Sustainability Week team, to Chung and Morgan and Dr. Mark, who's over there at Northeastern, Nikki Lowy, who helps with a lot of our events, and to a lot of the environmental leaders on this call, Susan Silber, and to our panelists who've done such a fabulous job today. Hope to stay in touch with everyone. It's not over yet. Let's keep building and working together. Have a wonderful day, everybody.